Hey, how's it going? I'm Luke. Today I'm gonna give you some tips on how to edit your photos. So I have 10 things that I thought of that are really helpful in kind of principles of learning how to edit. I'm not gonna necessarily show you like exactly how to move the bars around to edit your photo today, but I'm gonna give you some things for you to think about that will help you edit your photos like a professional. First thing I would say is to use Adobe Lightroom as well as Photoshop. But if you only have the choice between one of those things, I would choose Lightroom. I would say I use Lightroom for, I don't know, like 80%, maybe 90% of what I do in photography. I use Photoshop as really only for like photo manipulation. If I have something that I have to take out, if I have to like do some serious photo manipulation, that's really the only time I would use Photoshop. Otherwise, I use Lightroom for everything else. Like, I love Lightroom, and it's not only great for editing your photos, but it's also great for cataloging all of your images so you have them all organized in one spot. The second thing I would say is that editing is simpler than you think it is. I had this kind of imposter syndrome feeling for a long time about editing because I would just edit something and sometimes it wouldn't take me too long and I would like what it looks like and then I would say like, oh, that's it? And I was like, what do other people do? Like, what do professional photographers do? Like, how do they edit their photos? And as I became a professional photographer and as I started shooting large budget advertising shoots, as my wedding photography business grew, I realized that editing is a lot simpler than it seems. It just needs to look good and it doesn't really matter how you get there. So I would say don't overthink it. If you think it looks good, be done with it and move on. Should you use RAW or should you use JPEG? Since we're talking about editing specifically today, I would say use RAW format. That's a format that allows you to use all of the information that your camera takes. When you use JPEG, your camera throws away some of the information that you can't necessarily see with the settings that you used. If you want to be able to edit things, if you want to be able to see more of the sky that you shot or see more of the shadows in your photo, then using RAW is going to be way better in getting to the edit that you want. Number 4, presets. Do you have to have presets? Presets. Do you have to have the preset of the day in order to have good images? And I would say no. I have only used one preset pretty much my whole career, and that's been a preset that I've made. As I edited things year after year, I would actually save my own preset and build on my own preset year after year. I always felt like I was missing out if I didn't have like a preset. But what I realized as a photographer, the more you edit, the more that you can develop your own preset and you don't actually have to buy one. The great thing about presets is that it makes it really easy and it's pretty awesome. I would say don't feel bad if you use a preset, but I would encourage you to try to make your own presets because if you only rely on those, if you only rely on the work that someone else has done, and you'll never have a full grasp on how editing works. Number 5 is know your camera's dynamic range. So the dynamic range of your camera is how much your camera can take in the brightest brights and the darkest shadows. And then how much of that you can realistically edit into an image. Okay, one really practical way that you can start figuring out what your specific camera's dynamic range is to take photos with like some type of sky and then like buildings or a person that have kind of a silhouette in front of them. And then take photos at different exposures, right? Take a really bright version and take a whole bunch of different ones to where it's really dark. Pull that into Lightroom and then see what happens when you start moving those exposure sliders up and down. Let me show you an example. So here you have this kind of like bright sky in the background, and then you have these really dark buildings in the front. And so how you can test your dynamic range is seeing like, okay, what happens if I pull these shadows back? Does my camera do a good job of pulling back this information? Okay, and the same thing I can do with the shadows. Let's move the shadows to the extreme. What happens when I do that? Like, does it look crazy? Does it look really, really grainy? Does it like look terrible? So one thing I know about my camera, I shoot with a Nikon D750, is that it's really excellent in the shadows and it's not very good in the highlights. So anytime I have a situation like this that I'm shooting, I always lean on the dark side. So if I overshoot something and I try to bring the highlights back, it will just be blown out and white and there'll be no information there. So it's really important in editing to know how your camera would react in editing when you pull your highlights down and you pull your shadows up. And that's how you figure out your camera's dynamic range. And because I know my camera's dynamic range really well, this is before and this is after. Number 6 is editing is kind of like being in a forest without a map. And the only thing that you can follow is your heart. As I edit my photos, I'm really just like following what I feel and what I think is good. Like what my eyes are seeing, I'm like, ooh, I like that. Ooh, I don't like that. And that's pretty much how I go through all the settings, is I go back and forth through them all and say like, oh, I like when it does that. Oh, I don't like when it does that. So follow your heart when you're editing. If you like it, keep it. If you don't, change the setting. Number 7 is edit for emotion. Something that is really important for me in photography as a whole is that when I take a photo, the purpose of that photo is to be able to share with you the emotions of the moment that you weren't necessarily in, or the perspective that you didn't get to see, but I got to see. And I use photography to share that emotion with you. And that's my goal in editing. So my style isn't necessarily that every single photo that I take looks the same. My style is that you feel the emotion of the moment when you look at my photos. That can mean that my photos can look pretty different between shoots because my focus isn't that every photo that I take is gonna be edited the same way. I edit photos for the emotion that's needed in that moment. So here's an example. So here's this photo that I showed you earlier. It's very kind of dramatic and kind of moody, but that's in a lot of ways how it looked that morning, and that's how it felt to me when I was on the street shooting it. Like the same thing goes with this. Like this is a very kind of dark and moody photo. If you're from Toronto, you've seen this photo like 6.3 billion times. Everyone shoots this. But this is a really like dark and moody photo. This is a photo from like an engagement shoot that I took. Like this is edited completely different than those other 2 shots. But my focus here was there's a certain emotion that needs to be portrayed in a certain way. And that's using very like airy pastel tones as opposed to something like this, which is kind of like stark and kind of like not very soft and romantic feeling. Number 8 is edit in extremes. Just go through here and move everything from this side to this side and see what happens to your photo when you move around these settings. Go through down every single one and just go like, what would happen if I do this? Like, ooh, that's kind of cool. And then like, what happens? It's like, oh, I don't like that. Ooh, that's kind of cool. Like go through and just like go crazy, like have fun with it. So I would say the best way to learn how to edit is to go in here and just go crazy with the dials. That doesn't mean that your editing needs to look super intense and it needs to look like it's edited, but it's really important that you know what these sliders do from extreme to extreme so you know how to get your photo to where you want it to be. Number 9 is photos need massaging. It's really easy to get frustrated while you're editing because you want it just to like happen right away. You want to maybe even just like put a preset on and make it work. But the reality is that photos need massaging. Every time you bring in a new photo into Lightroom, every time you start editing again, every time you put a preset on a photo, it's gonna be different because light, every time you take a photo, like the light is so different. The colors are different. Every time you need to edit a photo, it needs some massaging. It needs some like, oh, I need to move these and try to edit this around. And then, oh, when I did that, like I gotta fix, it takes time. It takes fiddling around with a lot of things. And this is what I would suggest. When you begin massaging your photos, start with kind of like big changes and big sweeps. Don't get too stuck into like small details of like, oh, this needs to be perfect right away. So start with kind of the biggest changes up front. And then as you work on it more and more and more, start making more detailed changes as you go through the editing process. Number 10, and I think the most helpful tip in all of these, is to simply learn when you need to walk away from editing. When you're staring at the same photo for a while and you're trying to like figure it out, or maybe even if you get it to a place where you think you really like it, I highly suggest just like walking away, take a couple minutes to not look at your photo, even like walk away from it for a day and look at it the next day. You'd be surprised how many times you'll come back to your photo. Oh, that's what I did with that. It really helps your eyes to kind of reset, your brain to reset, and you're able to look at it with a whole new perspective when you just like give it a break for a little bit and come back. I hope those things were helpful in editing your photos. Like, I love editing so much. I hope this helps you enjoy the editing process and helps you get those images where you want them to be.